Hello YouTube, this is Morgan, Airspeed Prime here at my next Avatar Weekly discussion topic video. Usually do these kind of just audio and then have a bunch of like screenshots as the visuals, but with this one it's a much more kind of opinion focused one, so I kind of want to be on camera for this one. And, I'm just going to be talking about characters, so there's not really a lot I can do with regards to screenshots. So the topic for this video is going to be about a question I was asked on Tumblr recently, and that is what I consider to be, within the fandom, the most underrated and overrated characters and why. That was an interesting question. I gave a brief answer on Tumblr, but I wanted to do a video about it to discuss it in a bit more depth. So I'll cover Avatar: Last Airbender and Korra here, and I'll start with the underrated characters because obviously that's where I can focus on the positives of the characters. Now, I'll say at the start, this is my opinion looking in at the rest of the fandom. This is not like the characters I overrate or I underrate. This is the way kind of I tend to see the fandom in regards to how they in general view some of these characters. The first one that comes to mind for ATLA is May. May, I think, is a very underrated character, and is probably one of the few Avatar: The Last Airbender characters that gets hate within the fandom. I think a lot of that comes down to the fact that a lot of people really like Zuko and ship Zuko with other characters. And the other reason I would also put down is that she's one of the few characters I think people tend to be like, she's got a personality that I wouldn't like to meet in real life. Whereas, as a character, just like looking at her, analyzing her as a fictional character, she is actually like really interesting with what they do with her, and she has some really big moments, like the whole turning against Azula because she loves Zuko more than she fears Azula, is one of the biggest character moments in like the entire show, and it's a May moment, and that's really interesting that they do that. And I think especially the recent comic Smoke and Shadow, part 1, 2, and 3, really helped to delve much deeper into May as a character, get more into her emotions, because I think a lot of people tend to miss the mark, and they just see her as the emotionless character. And Zuko is this character who wears, who is, his emotions are kind of right there on the surface. You know how he feels about almost everything. There's a lot going on there. Whereas May is quite reserved and her emotions rarely come out. But I think in the comics and towards the end of the series, her emotions come out a lot freer. And that's where the interesting aspects of the characters comes out. And that Zuko is actually really interesting when he is a little bit calmer and he's not just like angst, anger, emotion, while May is kind of like that a lot of the time. She's quite reserved, but when a May is actually emotional, she's actually really interesting. And so the dynamic that May and Zuko have together in terms of like drawing the opposite aspect of each other out, in that like May calming Zuko down, Zuko kind of drawing emotion out of May, is a really interesting thing for their relationship. And it's definitely one of those things where like I've never really seen anyone who says that they hate May really give a good argument, especially now that we've kind of resolved the whole King of Omashu thing with not King of Omashu, Return to Omashu thing of like, wow, May doesn't really seem to care about Tom Tom, and the comics have very much made it clear that she really does care for her little brother a lot. So I think the comics have done a really good job. Like, if you really dislike May, read Smoke and Shadow, and I think you'll have a different perspective on her as a character. But yeah, definitely one of those characters. I've always really liked May as a character. I've always really liked the May and Zuko relationship. In the sense of, like, I've said many times before, like, I really don't understand where Zutara like really comes from, and the scenes people point to with that. Like, Zuko and Jin is an interesting relationship, but if you read like the Lost Adventures and you get the story that has Zuko, Jin, and May in it, and you see that basically when Zuko and May have their first kiss is like immediately after that Zuko and Jin date, showing that Zuko cares more for May than Jin. That's actually a really good written comic, one of the better ones from the Lost Adventures. Definitely people should check that out if they aren't aware of it. ATLA, other underrated characters. I find it very hard to pick underrated characters from ATLA in that I think in terms of overrated and underrated characters, Avatar: The Last Airbender, there aren't really that many. Um, I think most of the fandom tends to appreciate a lot of the characters, and outside of like the obvious ones, like oh, I hate Han as a character because he's annoying. Like that's fine. That's what the character's meant to be. The only other slightly underrated character that comes to mind would be Zhao. Maybe because I think he tends to get overlooked as being a good villain in ATLA because Azula exists. But Zhao is like the perfect Book One water villain. He is the character that shows you that Zuko is not the full-on villain. Zhao represents more of what the actual villainous Fire Nation is in terms of like fairly high up in the military, only cares about power, proving himself to Ozai. The perfect counterpart to Zuko for Book One as the guy who is basically out villaining, outdoing Zuko in terms of the bad stuff and highlighting Zuko's like struggle, and so their dynamic in Book One is actually really interesting. And then the spirit stuff that they do with Zhao in terms of Zhao being a guy who just completely doesn't care about spirits, disrespects them, and where they go at the end of Book One, where they go when like we see him again in Korra. Fascinating stuff because you see that he's been like basically tormented since that he made this horrible decision killing the moon spirit that one time, and he's been tormented ever since. It's a really interesting idea for a character. I think when people actually like analyze Book One, he gets the appreciation, but I think just overall people tend to forget about him because Azula is a character. Moving into Korra, I think the most underrated character is Unalaq. Because the villains are standout in Korra. All of the villains I think are really interesting. But I think people tend to over-exaggerate some of the other villains and really heavily put down Unalaq. When Unalaq is actually, in my mind, the most interesting villain in Korra. In a sense of, like, he's a member of Korra's family. He's Korra's uncle. There's this whole dynamic that he wanted so badly to have the Avatar as his daughter, son, or whatever. Like, there's a clear sense of like his plan was always to control the Avatar, whether that be having the Avatar as his own child, during Korra's early life trying to kidnap her, obviously being part of the Red Lotus, which is an interesting connection in and of itself. When that didn't work, he tried at various points during Korra's early life to kind of be one of her early trainers, but obviously her father kind of didn't allow that. Korra, in some dialogue in early Book 2, mentions that so that's why you're always trying to like take me away, have these kind of moments alone with me. That he's clearly trying to manipulate her over to his side, whether that be kidnapping her, forcing her, manipulating her. He was trying to get Korra onto his side to turn her into the Avatar that the Red Lotus wanted. When that didn't work out, when he realized he couldn't get Korra on his side by any other means, he decided he wanted to become the Avatar himself, because that was the only way at that point to do it. And this was him going off script against the Red Lotus plans and becoming the Dark Avatar himself, merging with Unalaq. And, I've talked a bunch in the past about him. I even have I think my first ever Avatar Weekly discussion topic video was about Unalaq, so just go really watch that if you want to get my full thoughts on him. But this idea that he prioritized spirits more than his own family. That even Tonraq, who has so much reason to hate his brother, his brother is behind his banishment, tried to kill Korra, kill Jinora, badly beat him in their fight. All of this stuff betraying his brother, and Tonraq is still open at the end to his brother kind of, I suppose, rejoining the family properly, but Unalaq obviously goes against that. He just refuses to join and prioritizes freeing Vaatu over anything, to the point where he loses his humanity. When Vaatu takes over, he properly takes over. Like, Unalaq is not really present in Unavaatu at all. And so, when Eska and Desna see him, they realize that their father is gone here. He lost himself to Vaatu, and it's a very different type of Avatar to like the actual good Avatar, Rava and Korra, where neither of them like properly take over the other one. They're just both there kind of equally. So Unlock, I think, is very underappreciated. He has so much link into what that season is overall about, and it just works really well. The other core character I think is underappreciated is Mako. Mako is another character, kind of like Mei, who tends to get a lot of hate, where I think the reasons aren't really about the character himself. The problem with Mako is actually the writing of Mako. That the writers wrote most of his story to be romance. And that became a problem over time because he wasn't really doing much. And especially in the second half of the season, of the series, book 3 and 4, they just like realized like, oh, people don't like him. Why don't they like him? Let's just shove him into the background and only give him like 1 or 2 moments. Whereas I think early on they highlighted more of what the positive sides of Mako that they kind of forgot about later on. The fact that he's really intelligent, he becomes a detective, a very good detective and police officer. He is one of the most skilled benders in Korra. I think a lot of people tend to forget that and underestimate how powerful Mako is. But Mako doesn't often lose fights. He's the captain of the firefighters for a reason. When it comes to the big fights, he, like in terms of the end of book 3, Bolin has lava bending, but Mako defeats Minghua on his own. He then comes in to help Bolin defeat Gazan. So that's an interesting one. Then he has lightning redirection and generation. That's a very very impressive feat. The big sacrifice he makes, obviously in book 4, is very impressive, and just in general, is a quite selfless character. And I think a lot of people tend to think of him as selfish and that like he only cares about his own romance stuff, when that's very much not the case. Like I think a lot of people tend to say, even like the episode I really don't like of Korra, Remembrances, it tends to like retcon the series to kind of be that Korra taught Mako how to be selfless, when in fact I think it's the other way around. Mako's always been somewhat selfless, in that he puts himself on the line for Korra against Amon, and that kind of inspires Korra to put herself on the line for other people. So I think people tend to forget that, the importance of Mako, especially in the first 2 seasons, and then he's kind of forgotten a bit in the second 2 seasons. He is still a really interesting character in terms of being intelligent, an excellent police officer, and that just kind of got lost a bit. So like when the core comics come out, I really hope Mako has a proper arc to himself and he's written well. But let's move into the overrated characters, and obviously this marks a shift in the video. I'm going to be talking more about the negatives of characters, just to potentially highlight overrated characters. In ATLA, I don't think a lot of people overrate a lot of characters. I think the only one that really comes to mind is Toph, and I don't really think Toph is a bad character or anything like that. I just think she is at times overrated. Like when a lot of people say that their favorite character is Toph, I'm just kind of like, really? Toph over like Aang, Zuko, Katara, Sokka? The reason I say that is because she is the main character in ATLA with the least amount of like main plot. In terms of character development for Toph, her main arc is her relationship with her parents, and it's left for the Rift comic series to resolve that for her character. Otherwise, all of her development is basically in the episode where she joins the group, the Blind Bandit. It's her being kept away from people by her parents, and her deciding herself to go with these people who treat her well and form friendships with them. That's kind of Toph's arc. It's very simple. It's just like she gains friends, and then the other part of her arc is she becomes more powerful over time with the metal bending and sand bending and stuff like that. Her main character arc is very much forgotten, and then a lot of the other stuff they just tend to deal with is like little arguments that she has with characters, like the arguments with Katara in those 2 episodes, one in book 2, one in book 3. It's like, okay, they had arguments and you're making a big deal about that, but in general she's the character with the least amount of, I think, emotional impact from the show, and that a lot of the important stuff with her is left for the comics to resolve. I still really like the character, of course. The really interesting way to do a kind of blind character in the show, but make her super powerful. The emotional moments that they do have in her introduction are very well done, and like she is a very different character from when we first meet her compared to the end. And then especially when you kind of go into Korra and see how she is a character who in like her later life had the most, I suppose, kind of family problems and stuff like that. I think it is really interesting, but just in terms of the way most people tend to see her, she tends to be one of those characters who is top of someone's list because she is just this character who like never loses a fight. That she's just really powerful and stuff like that. Where on the more character arc side of things, I think she's a little bit weak, but still absolutely deserves to be near the top of a lot of people's list. But I just think a lot of people do tend to like overrate her at the expense of kind of better characters. Um, Other than that, ATLA characters, you can sort of say some people perhaps overrate Zuko with how crazy into the character they are. Azula at times I think can also step into that category where a lot of people tend to be like over sympathetic towards her. Azula is deserving of some sympathy, of course, because of how she was raised, and like she's not 100% responsible for like the way she turned out, but she is still a villain and stuff like that. So, but she is probably the best villain in ATLA, so I don't think there's too much to say there. Toph is really the only ATLA character I think is overrated. Uh, Korra, I think, has a lot more obvious overrated characters. The first one that comes to mind is like all of the Red Lotus. Zahir, not as much as the other three, but because people tend to group all four of them together, I think the overall Red Lotus group tends to be the most overrated characters in the entire fandom. These characters are the definition of being defined by your bending powers. This is like Toph, but an even kind of better example of the issue, in that Gazan and Minghua especially have like 2 or 3 lines of dialogue in the entire run that they are in the series. We know nothing about them as characters beyond their bending abilities and how they look. And there are even little hints that there's much more there than we know of. And especially with the fact that they're killed off at the end of the season, it's just like, okay, we're never going to get to see them again. Like that's really disappointing to me. Because there's a ton of potential. You could go into depth in terms of how these characters adapt to having such powerful bending abilities, why they believe so much in Zahir and the Red Lotus movement and freedom and stuff like that. How did this group really come together? Pali is a little bit separated from Gazan and Minghua because of her relationship with Zahir, and us knowing a little bit about how she came to join the group at least, and the interesting stuff about her combustion bending and the warlord. But even that, it's not gone into in a lot of depth, and she again doesn't have a lot of dialogue and is mainly just there to blow stuff up, and that's it. Zahir is, I still would consider a little bit overrated in that I think his character was kind of saved by his reappearance in book 4, in that, hey, not killing him off, but keeping him like in play kind of, made his character so much more interesting. Because they made a few mistakes, I think, with him in book 3, with regards to like the end, him kind of turning into like a very stereotypical villain, when he's defeated, him like really freaking out, kind of, it felt very out of character what was happening, and stuff like that. And then it, just the way they gradually over the course of time in book 3 revealed the plot of the Red Lotus, like he was the one delivering everything. The Red Lotus really needed a little bit more backstory to them in terms of showing us like Zhaibao, the formation of the Red Lotus, splitting off from the White Lotus, and really just getting into depth on all 4 of these characters in terms of why they are so against, world leaders and stuff like that. They are still really interesting, it's just they just didn't go far enough into characterizing these characters. Way too much time was spent with regards to their fighting skills and bending abilities, and it's the prime example of that kind of like style over character type thing. I think Kuvira is slightly overrated. I think she's better than the Red Lotus, but I think she still suffers from some similar problems in that the writers, I think, made the mistake of thinking that the connection between Su Yin and Kuvira would have come across clearer in the show than it actually did. Whereas I really think that you needed to show in the past them having a more mother-daughter relationship to make Kuvira separating from Su Yin and going off on this path all the more impactful. The way it is right now, it's just like Sue, I disagree with you for not taking over control of the Earth Kingdom during this time of crisis. I am going to, like, take your son away from you and hurt you by becoming a tyrant myself. Like, her arc just was missing this key point where she switches from disagreeing with Suyin to becoming the villain that she is. Just a little bit of backstory I think is missing from her. Otherwise, like, amazing counterpart to Korra. But I just think Amon and Unalaq are the more complete villains in Korra, and so I think the book 3 and 4 villains tend to get a little bit overrated. Um, what else? Asami I think has become a little overrated, um, purely because of the Korra Asami ending to book 4. I think a lot of people have tended to dismiss a lot of criticism of the Korra Asami relationship that I think is very valid. The fact that it really wasn't developed all that much, and it kind of was a bit of a surprise that it ended up happening, in the sense of it wasn't like finally these two characters are together. It's kind of like, care to explain to me a little bit more of the setup on this? And part of that I think comes down to the fact that Asami wasn't all that used for a lot of this series. She's not a character who really has a specific arc of her own, in terms of, like, her main arc really involves her father in, like, book 1 and book 4 as kind of like the bookmarks to her story. And then, like, in book 2 they kind of have a kind of a business arc with Varric where she's betrayed. Mako is kind of framed for it, but Varric ultimately is the one behind it. She, has this kind of friendship arc with Korra in book 3, but they didn't quite do enough to really, I think, get across that this was a kind of blossoming romance kind of type thing. So I think for a lot of people, the kind of finale, the big moment in the finale, fell a little flat because Asami and Korra, in the grand scheme of the series, didn't really interact all that much. And when they did, not that many of their scenes had the emotional impact of, like, again, showing this kind of friendship forming into a romance. That's why the Korra comics coming out are going to be so important in terms of, like, I suppose, retroactively telling us about their relationship and how the two felt about each other over the course of the series, which really wasn't conveyed to us. But it's obviously not just the Korra Asami relationship that I think people tend to overrate. That like contributes to Asami being overrated. Like, just her as a character, like, where was her arc? She again is one of those characters who in combat is seen as very powerful with regards to her equal as Chocolove. She's a pretty good acrobat. She's an amazing pilot. They just never really, I think, properly found the way to use her effectively, in the same way as, say, like a Mako. Mako they actually used very well in terms of combat and stuff like that in the series. You had no doubts about how strong he was. Asami, they just at times held back on her when I think they could have done something with her. That's why I think in the Korra comics it is so important to have Asami have an arc of her own in addition to developing the Korra-Asami relationship. The worst thing that the Korra comics can do going forward is make Asami just Korra's girlfriend and have nothing related to her individually. So there's that. And I think that's about it, really. Like, I think in general the Avatar fandom tends to really heavily understand the story content that we get. And so not a lot of characters are, like, heavily over exaggerated or overrated. And again, not a lot of characters are underrated. There's just a few. For me, it's only the couple I mentioned here, really. And that's quite good, because I think there's a lot of other kind of series out there where there are characters who are just not respected at all. That is really not the case in this fandom, and that, like I said, Mei was underrated, but there are a ton of people out there who really like Mei, and that came across very heavily during Smoke and Shadow as it came out. A lot of Mei fans really appreciating that. Unalaq, I just think is, like, very underappreciated. In my mind, I'm probably one of the only people within the fandom who's really aware of the kind of complexities of the characters and really likes him all that much. And then on the other side of things, the overrated characters, I also tend to feel that just because the Red Lotus are so well liked, that I'm one of the only people who's like, Yeah, call me again when they get some character development kind of type thing with them. Um, Similar with the Toph thing, I'm like, I like Toph, but I don't like her like that much. Lynn, I think also in Korra suffers a little bit from the Toph syndrome of being like being seen as amazing just because she's got a similar attitude to Toph. That she's, you know, like Sokka says actually in the Ember Island Players, you know, like you just arrive, like smash people's heads in, and like cool. Like you don't have any like complex thing that kind of in any way brings down your character. You are always just considered amazing. I think that at times people tend to overrate that type of character. But yeah, that's been the video. Of course, you know, this is just my opinion. I like all of these characters. The only characters I'm actually like very critical of would be the Red Lotus. I think they are just objectively underdeveloped as characters, and I don't really see them as great characters all that much. Everyone else that I mentioned in this video, underrated and overrated, I really like in terms of the fandom and their arcs. But yeah, that's been the video. In the comments, let me know what your thoughts were on the video, and what characters do you think the fandom sees as overrated, underrated, or what? So yeah, also in the comments let me know what you want the next weekly discussion video to be about Avatar. But yeah, that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.